Throughout history, we've been obsessed with turning things that are kind of crappy into stuff that's pretty amazing. You know, we've turned rocks and sea junk into great works of art, and turned sand into these neat things. And we've even managed to turn this black muck into electricity. Oh, we've got something super crappy this time. CO2 pollution, and lots of it. And we don't know what to do with it. But what if I told you that we could take everyday carbon pollution and turn it into a whole bunch of amazing things and help solve climate change in the process? So the big one is carbon. Now carbon is it's the building block of life. You're made of carbon. Trees are made of carbon. Your food is made of carbon. It gets a bad rap, but carbon and CO2 is our friend. You know, we can use it to build a whole bunch of amazing things, or we can put it away for safekeeping. It only becomes a problem once it gets out of hand. But before we get to that, let's go back a little bit. Before life arose on the planet, the world was completely inhospitable. The primordial Earth was blanketed in an enormous amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and it was extremely hot and totally devoid of life. Now, over millions of years, early life began and gradually turned atmospheric carbon into cells, algae, and bacteria. Eventually, after enough of this carbon was turned into life, and that life was fossilized into pools of carbon buried deep underground, the atmosphere began to change for the better. It brought the CO2 levels in the atmosphere down to hospitable levels. It cooled the planet down, and it made way for complex life like us. And complex life has flourished, and we're awesome. Go complex life. So where does that leave us today? We've got access to these huge pools of fossil carbon, and we're pulling it from the Earth, and we're turning it back into CO2. We're turning our atmosphere back into a primordial CO2-dense hot greenhouse. So, you know, it's going to be incredibly bad for large organisms and complex organisms, and incredibly good for simple life like algae. So, you know, the Earth's going to be fine, right? It's just going to be primordial. All right, so let's say we don't want that, right? Let's say we're happy being complex organisms living a complex life as human beings. In that case, there are a couple of big things we need to solve. The obvious one is that we need to stop taking stuff in the ground and putting that stuff in the sky, right? People will say it's not that simple, but it really is. We are going to stop releasing carbon into the atmosphere. We need to start putting it back into the Earth and into the ecosystem. So how do we do this? The first big way is called sequestration, or as I like to call it, putting the carbon back in the box. Sequestration is just a big fancy way of saying that we're going to capture the atmospheric CO2, pop it back in the ground. Okay, it sounds complicated, right? But wait, we're going to do it together. Okay, you ready? Now look at this cactus. This cactus just sequestered carbon from the atmosphere and turned it into cactus. Which brings us to the first bit of carbon alchemy that we can do to help solve climate change. And that's one that everyone is familiar with. Planting forests. So that is the amazing thing about trees. People think that the tree is growing from the soil, but the tree is actually growing from the air. That the tree is taking atmospheric CO2 from the air and turning it into tree. So when you see a tree, you're actually looking at carbon that was once floating around in the atmosphere. That means more trees, less carbon pollution. Super simple. It goes even deeper than that, right? There's a guy called Alan Savory who's done a tremendous amount of work in taking these barren desert environments and turning them into living ecosystems. The soil is one of the largest stores of carbon on the planet. So when wildlife poops onto the desert soil, it is literally sequestering that carbon back into the soil, and it's allowing plants to grow, and it's allowing the ecosystem to flourish. Through agricultural and technological processes, we've turned a whole bunch of thriving ecosystems into barren wastelands. And in the process, we've removed enormous sections of the carbon stores of the planet. Reforestation is just straight up one of the key ways we're going to get the carbon out of the atmosphere and back into the ground. The carbon in the atmosphere becomes trees and plants and algae and bacteria and birds and bees and all kinds of things, you know? It absolutely blows my mind to think about it. If this was a technological advancement, it'd make headlines. Just think about it. We're able to take CO2 pollution and turn it into actual plants and animals and an ecosystem. This will never not be amazing to me. So reforestation. It's super important. It also happens to be our moral responsibility to vote in the kind of people who will act on this urgently. So why wait until the carbon becomes pollution, I hear you asking? Why not capture it at the source? Why not put a big lid on those ugly smokestacks, right? Well, researchers have done exactly this. They take the carbon dioxide before it leaves the coal plant, and they bubble it through a series of tubes filled with algae. Now, I consider this kind of thing to be a kind of an artificial tree. It's serving the same basic purpose. The pipes are a type of proxy leaf as the algae takes the CO2 and the sunlight and turns it into more algae, effectively sequestering the carbon and stopping it before it even enters the atmosphere. And there's plenty of other proven direct carbon sequestration methods that we can and must be implementing today. Then there are a bunch of other topics related to consumption worth touching on. The really obvious one is to cut back on red meat. Now, I love red meat, but what are you going to do? It's not viable. It's crazy high compared to the next one down in terms of carbon footprint. It's out of control. Maybe every now and then. Be super aware of it. And even how we treat our sewage is an opportunity to sequester carbon. After treatment, our poo becomes biosolids, which are often burned back into the atmosphere as CO2 pollution. There's no excuse to not use this as an opportunity to sequester carbon. You've already got it as a solid, and then you're burning it then back into the atmosphere. It's insane. So we've talked about sequestration, but there's another one that we haven't talked about yet, and I call it not using coal. Now, I quite like the method called not using coal, and there are a bunch of promising technologies out there to achieve this, like solar power, wind power, tidal generation. Those are the big friendly faces of renewable energy, and we need to begin moving towards these with a sense of urgency. Now, mostly what this means for us is that we simply need to vote for the people who will act on climate change. That said, it's going to take time for us to get there. It's still really hard to make the numbers work on renewables alone. If we struggle to replace coal immediately, and if politicians are going to continue to push for coal plants, they need to be coal plants that sequester CO2. It can no longer be free for them to store their pollution in our atmosphere. There must be a price. You can't park your car in my driveway without paying the rent. Coal plants in Australia must directly emit their pollution into sequestration plants. Okay? A coal plant can't exist on its own anymore. A coal plant must be a coal plant plus a sequestration plant. It's those two, side by side. You can't have one without the other. It's not the 1800s anymore. And that has to be law, right? It has to be law. It's our atmosphere. We're not going to let you store your pollution in it anymore. When I think about this problem, I'm always struck by how elegant system imbalance actually is. To think that solving pollution comes down to creating new life and clean energy systems, it makes me excited. I am certain we can solve this if we can just vote the bastards out who are being criminally negligent about the future of our planet and our economy, and start to vote some responsible people into positions of power. There is no excuse for Australia to not become the world leaders in renewable energy. This right now can be the dawn of the renewable energy revolution, if we want it to be. If you and I want it to be.